Yesterday was a big day in the world of big oil, but perhaps for the planet as well. Pro-climate shareholders at two of the world's largest oil and gas companies took part in investor coups. At Exxon, a small activist hedge fund they led a David and Goliath campaign that successfully replaced two Exxon board members with candidates who will try to drive a greener strategy for Exxon. It's a blow to the company that's historically not only been at the forefront of climate denial, but has even funded climate-denying scientists. Over at Chevron, in a coordinated effort by an investor rebellion group, a majority of shareholders went against the company's board by overwhelmingly voting in favor of an activist proposal that would force Chevron to cut its carbon emissions and examine the effects on where it operates. The founder of the Dutch investor group Follow This said these shareholder revolts mark an investor paradigm shift and a victory in the fight against climate change. The big oil changes aren't just domestic. The same group was also behind a Netherlands court ruling yesterday that forces Royal Dutch Shell to cut its 2019 carbon emissions, the levels in 2019, cut them by 45% by 2030. It's all welcome news, of course, and unprecedented. But these fossil fuel giants have not only failed for decades to respond to the profound existential threat of climate change, they didn't push for these changes that we've seen over the past 48 hours. In fact, they might now be pushing back. Already a spokesperson for Shell said the company expects to appeal what it described as a disappointing court decision. One analyst has said the implications of the changes at Exxon are, quote, largely inconsequential and largely symbolic. And Chevron hasn't said how it'll cut its emissions, while meanwhile defending itself in a 28-year, multi-billion-dollar lawsuit that alleges it damaged the quality of life for residents in Ecuador. We're talking about companies that are hugely responsible for the climate crisis. In fact, a study from just earlier this year found that we've underestimated the emissions of methane, for example, by oil and gas companies by up to 40%. That's after research that has already shown 20 fossil fuel companies have contributed more than a third of all greenhouse gas emissions since 1965. With Exxon, Chevron, Shell, and BP, you'll be shocked to discover leading the pack. Remember, these cuts that are being announced should have been done yesterday. And when I say yesterday, I mean years ago, decades ago, because that's how long many of these companies have known full well what they're doing and how they're harming the climate with their emissions. In fact, investigations show that Exxon and Shell were aware of climate change and the role of fossil fuels in contributing to it as early as the late 70s and early 80s. So, are these announcements from the world of big oil just too little, too late? Or are they the start of something historic and something substantive? Joining me now to discuss this is MSNBC Daily contributor Emily Atkin. She's also the author and founder of Heated, a daily newsletter on the climate crisis. Emily, thanks for coming back on the show. There's been a lot of talk about this recent news, about Exxon, Chevron, Shell, it being a seismic shift in the industry. Is it, in your view, can two new pro-climate board members really transform a company like Exxon with its long history of funding climate denialism in a substantive, in a consequential way?
It absolutely is. I mean, for me as a climate reporter, this is a signal that investors are starting to sort of rebuke the lie that has been told by fossil fuel companies for 40 years, as you just said, that the climate crisis is all of our faults, that we all have an equal role to play, that if we want to stop emissions, then we simply must individually stop consuming so many things. Investors themselves are starting to realize that they have that these companies that they're invested in are the largest climate polluters in the world. This is a disproportionate impact, and they have the power to change the trajectory. I mean, the reason that I have an appreciation for ExxonMobil in a way and Chevron, because ExxonMobil and Chevron are two of the companies that have really just said, we don't really want to reduce carbon emissions that much. We're just not going to do it. And in these investor actions, the shareholders have sort of said, not only is that strategy morally inept, it's also financially stupid. And I don't want to be involved in a company that has that type of strategy. So I feel like it is a turning of the tide where investors are realizing that if these companies don't want to change on their own, then they have the power to change these companies themselves.
So you expect us to see more of this, that this is kind of the opening of the door?
I see it as a sign that the general public no longer believes the lie. Exxon CEO Darren Woods has himself called climate change pledges by oil companies a beauty contest. It's, like I said, it's one of the reasons why I almost love ExxonMobil, is because they speak the part out loud that you're not supposed to hear. And it's sort of this sign that regular people don't believe the BS anymore. I mean, that's always been the big obstacle to climate action, is that regular people think, I don't know, maybe it is up to individuals.
Yes, you put it well. He says, it's all of us, it's all of us. It's one of the great cons from the world of big oil. How much of what we're seeing from the companies themselves is about staving off criticism and keeping the businesses alive and popular? How much of it is about, okay, maybe we got this wrong?
I mean, it's hard to know exactly what's going on internally at these companies. One of the things that you'll see has been rejected at the Chevron shareholder vote. You know, the investors were successful in getting Chevron to commit to reduce emissions, but they weren't committed on getting Chevron to disclose their lobbying activities and their political activities behind the scenes. And until you know that, you really don't know exactly what these companies are actually trying to do if they refuse to disclose all of their political contributions. For me, in my experience with most of these pledges, they are what Exxon CEO Darren Woods said himself: beauty competitions, ways to make us think, oh, no worries, Exxon and Chevron and Shell are doing their best. They're partners in the climate crisis, and not 40 years of funding climate denial and funding climate denying politicians. We just stopped, you know, and now we're investing in biofuels. So you should definitely buy Shell gas.
It's such a good point you make about opening up the lobbying activities to find out, you know, actions speak louder than words, and that would be fascinating to see. In terms of the Dutch court's ruling on Shell, the verdict may be the first time in history that a company has been legally obliged to align its policies with climate emissions agreements, with the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, for example. Is this the kind of successful legal action we might be seeing more of going forward in the courts?
Well, this is the kind of legal action that we're going to see attempted now in different courts, because once you see one successful ruling in one court, you see a strategy that gets one of the largest polluters, climate polluters in the world, to have to change their course. So, you know, obviously not all courts are the same. We have different laws in different countries. But what you see here is a successful strategy, and that is worth everything. Because if you have been following climate change for as long as I have, you know that you don't get a lot of successes. And when you get a day like yesterday, the day that we just had, you get so many ways for potential success that we did not have before. And when it comes to the future of life on Earth, that's worth everything. And so that's why I'm really trying to take this not as a law, not as like a loss for big oil, but as like a win for life on Earth, for you and me, for everything we hold dear.
But also, people in the activist space sometimes struggle with cherishing victories. It's very easy to focus on the defeats, but much harder to kind of cherish and say, hey, we won one. You mentioned different courts in different places. It kind of went under the radar. But last week, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling in favor of big oil. The case had to do with which courts the city of Baltimore can sue big oil in and hold them accountable in for their role in allegedly endangering certain communities. It's one thing to hear about these changes at Exxon and Chevron, etc. But how effective can the pro-climate movement be if Republicans have successfully stacked our courts with anti-environmentalist, anti-regulation judges all the way up to the Supreme Court?
It's the biggest threat that the climate movement in the United States faces. I would say that the tobacco litigation, the litigation that held tobacco companies accountable for poisoning Americans for years and got them to really pay for the damage that they did. Both climate activists and oil companies know that this is the biggest threat that oil companies face in the United States. This is the success path to litigation that we know is possible. And so if you stack the court with judges like, let's say, Amy Coney Barrett, whose father worked for Shell for 29 years as a corporate attorney, during the very time that Shell first found out about global warming and decided to hide it, a decision that was almost certainly the corporate lawyers at Shell were part of that decision, right? And then Amy Coney Barrett refuses to recuse herself from the case against Shell to hold it accountable for lying about climate change. This is the most important. This is the most important thing that we can be paying attention to when it comes to the Supreme Court, in my opinion. It's the future of the planet.
I'm shocked to hear you suggest that Amy Coney Barrett might be compromised at all on any issue like this. I'm shocked to hear you say that. Before we run out of time, Emily, one last quick question. Joe Biden's been in office more than 100 days now. Rate him for us in terms of his action on climate change. If I gave you a score of 1 to 10, where would you put the Biden administration on climate change? 10 being good, 1 being awful.
Well, I think everything is obviously a spectrum. I would give the Biden administration a solid 7 in terms of rhetoric and in terms of putting forward proposals to actually address the climate crisis. What I would say the Biden administration could maybe could get a little more serious on is the language in which they use to address the climate crisis. They're doing a lot of compromise in the infrastructure plan. Yeah. If you watch any interview that like John Kerry and Gina McCarthy are doing, they are not willing to say that the oil industry is an enemy. You know, there's sort of a lack of really real talk. And sometimes you think progress is progress. This is so much better than the Trump era. But this is a dire crisis, and we really need our leaders to be addressing it like that.
But it's 7 out of 10 is your score. It's 7 out of 10 is what you're giving him tonight.
I mean, part of it is probably just because I'm so still traumatized from the Trump era. You know,
okay.
I was really,
I mean, look.
Really
7 out of 10. 7 out of 10 isn't bad. The Asian parent in me says, Joe, you should have got 10. MSNBC Daily contributor, author of Heated, Emily Atkin, thank you so much for your time and your analysis tonight. Appreciate it. Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of the Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.